The afternoon was peaceful in the small suburban town of Portland, Oregon. The sky was washed in shades of gold, and the warm air carried the smell of freshly cut grass. Margaret Green stood in her backyard trimming the edges of her rose bushes. Gardening was her quiet comfort, the one thing that always helped her slow down and feel grounded, ever since her husband passed and her daughter Emily left for college. Silence had become both her friend and her companion. She enjoyed that silence most days. But sometimes when the wind rustled the trees and the sun dipped behind the fence, she felt the stillness too sharply. That afternoon felt like one of those days. She had just wiped her hands on her apron when she heard the faint creak of the front gate. She frowned slightly. Hardly anyone ever came unannounced. When she turned, she saw a young man standing at the edge of her yard. His tall frame, nervous posture. An uncertain smile made her blink before recognition hit. It was Ethan, her daughter's boyfriend. "Ethan," she called, brushing the dirt off her hands. "What are you doing here, sweetheart?" Emily, still at school, gave a small smile, polite but tense. "Hi, Mrs. Green. Yeah, I know. I came to talk to you, actually." Margaret's brows lifted. That wasn't something she expected. She had met Ethan only twice before, once at dinner when Emily first introduced him, and another time at Christmas when he stopped by to drop off a gift. He'd always been quiet, respectful, a bit shy, but kind. Seeing him now, standing alone in her yard with worry in his eyes, stirred both curiosity and concern. "Of course," she said softly. "Come inside. You look like you could use a glass of lemonade." He followed her onto the porch, his steps hesitant. Margaret noticed the way he kept glancing around the yard at the flowers, at the small wooden swing her late husband had built, and at the fading sunset. There was something heavy about him, like he was carrying more than he could say. She poured him a drink and sat across from him, wiping her hands again on the edge of her apron. So she began gently, "What brings you here, Ethan? Everything all right with Emily?" He didn't answer right away. His eyes lingered on the glass before him, then lifted to meet hers. "I hope you don't mind me just showing up like this," he said slowly. "I didn't really know who else to talk to." Margaret's chest tightened slightly. "You can always talk to me," she said. "You're practically family." That made him smile faintly. "That means more than you think." He murmured. Something about his tone made her put her gardening gloves aside and give him her full attention. He leaned back, staring into the distance as if trying to gather his thoughts. "Emily and we've been okay, I guess. But lately I feel like I'm losing her. And I don't even know what I did wrong." Margaret listened quietly. She'd been in love once. She knew how confusing it could be when things started to drift. Ethan continued, his voice steady but soft. "She's been distant these last few weeks. Calls less, texts less. I thought maybe it was school, but it feels like something else. I thought about talking to her, but then I thought, maybe I should talk to you first." Margaret tilted her head slightly, surprised. "Me? Why me?" He smiled faintly. "Because you understand her better than anyone, and because I respect you." The sincerity in his tone disarmed her. She hadn't expected that. He wasn't just another college kid worried about his relationship. There was something deeper here. "Well," she said kindly, "sometimes distance isn't about love fading. Sometimes it's just life pulling in different directions. Emily's growing, learning who she is. It doesn't mean she's forgotten you." Ethan nodded, but his expression didn't ease. "I know, but it's more than that." He paused. "It's me. I haven't been the same lately. I've been lost." The word lingered. Margaret leaned forward, her tone softening. "Lost how?" He took a slow breath. "Since my mom passed last year, I've tried to hold everything together. Work, school, Emily, but I never really grieved. I thought keeping busy would help. But now I feel empty. And the one person who made me feel okay, Emily, she's slipping away." Margaret's heart ached as he spoke. She had seen that kind of pain before. The quiet kind that doesn't scream or cry but just lingers inside someone until it hardens. "I didn't know you lost your mother," she said softly. "I'm so sorry, Ethan." He nodded. Yeah, she was everything to me. And when I lost her, I guess I started clinging to anything that felt like home. That's what Emily became for me. He paused, glancing toward the garden. And this house. You? The peace here. I can't explain it, but every time I visit, I feel something I haven't felt in a long time. Like I belong somewhere again. Margaret blinked, not expecting the warmth in his voice when he said that. There was nothing inappropriate about it. It was just deeply human. A young man searching for grounding, finding comfort where the world had given him none. You remind me of her sometimes, he said quietly. My mom, the way you talk, the way you keep things simple but beautiful. It's comforting. For a moment, Margaret didn't know what to say. She felt an ache in her chest, part sorrow for him, part something else she couldn't quite name. Well, she said finally, her tone gentle, then maybe that's why you were meant to come here today. Not to fix things, but to remember that you're not alone. Ethan nodded slowly, his eyes glistening. That's what I hoped. I didn't come here to make things harder. I just needed someone to talk to. Someone who would listen without judging. Margaret smiled softly. Then you came to the right place. They sat in silence for a few moments, the sound of crickets filling the air as dusk deepened. The tension seemed to ease as the evening grew cooler. Ethan seemed lighter. As if the simple act of speaking had freed something he'd been holding on to for too long, Margaret watched him and felt a familiar, maternal pull, not for her daughter's boyfriend, but for a young soul who clearly needed a place to rest. Then he looked up suddenly, his eyes steady. There's something I need to tell you, he said. Her heart skipped slightly at his tone. It wasn't fear or sadness, it was something deeper, something honest. What is it, Ethan? She asked softly. He hesitated. It's about Emily, he said slowly, and what she told me last night. Margaret straightened. What did she say? He exhaled heavily. She told me she doesn't know what she wants anymore. Not about us. Not about her life. She said she feels like she's failing everyone, especially you. The words hit Margaret harder than she expected. Failing me. Why would she say that? Because she thinks she hasn't done enough. She told me you've given her everything and she's afraid she's letting you down. She said she's scared you'll think she's wasting her life. Margaret felt her eyes sting. Oh, that girl, she murmured, shaking her head. She could never disappoint me. Ethan smiled faintly. That's what I told her. But she didn't believe me. He looked at her then, a kind of quiet determination in his gaze. That's why I came here. I wanted to understand you better so I can help her see what she can't right now. Margaret stared at him, surprised. You came here for her? Yes, he said simply. Because she deserves someone who truly listens. And I think that starts with me learning how to. It was rare for someone so young to speak with such sincerity. Margaret realized then that Ethan wasn't just a boy in love, he was someone who understood what it meant to care deeply. Even through pain, as the first stars began to appear, Margaret stood and looked at the horizon. Ethan, she said softly, I think you're going to be just fine. And Emily's lucky to have someone like you. He smiled, his shoulders relaxing for the first time. Thank you, Mrs. Green. I didn't expect this talk to help so much. She nodded. Sometimes we just need to be reminded that love in any form is meant to heal, not hurt. As he got up to leave, the porch light flickered on, casting a warm glow between them. The air felt lighter, peaceful again. Ethan turned to her before stepping out. You know, he said, almost shyly, you have a way of making things feel okay, just like my mom used to. Margaret's heart swelled, a mix of pride and quiet sadness. Then I'll take that as a compliment, she said with a small smile. When he walked away down the street, the night was calm again. But Margaret knew something had shifted, not in a dramatic way, but in a gentle, lasting one. She realized that even when life feels empty, sometimes comfort comes in unexpected forms, in words shared, in quiet understanding, in the courage to care for someone else's pain. And somewhere deep down, she felt that this moment, this visit, would be the beginning of something quietly meaningful, not just for Ethan and Emily, but for herself too. The next morning, the sun peeked through the kitchen window, spilling soft light across the worn wooden table. Margaret sat there with her cup of coffee, staring at the small vase of daisies Ethan had picked from her garden before leaving the night before. His visit had lingered in her mind all night. She'd gone to bed thinking about the way he spoke, not like a young man confused about love, but like someone searching for a place to belong. There was something honest, something rare in that conversation, and it had stirred a quiet ache in her heart. She had always liked Ethan. He was polite, grounded, thoughtful qualities that reminded her of her late husband, Tom. But last night she had seen more than a polite young man. She had seen his grief, his words about his mother, his need for peace. They had reminded her of her own loneliness, the quiet gaps that time never quite filled. She sighed, taking another sip of her coffee when the phone buzzed on the counter. It was a message from Emily. "Hey Mom, heading home this weekend. Need to talk to you about something. Love you." Margaret smiled softly, but something about the message made her uneasy. Emily's tone was sweet, but the need to talk part echoed in her head. What could be so important that she wanted to discuss it in person? Later that afternoon, the doorbell rang. Margaret opened the door to find Ethan standing there again, this time holding a grocery bag and that same unsure smile. "I hope I'm not bothering you," he said. "I just wanted to bring over the things I borrowed from Emily last week and maybe help out a bit around the house." Margaret blinked, surprised. "You don't have to do that." "I know," he said, "but I want to." Something in his sincerity disarmed her again. She stepped aside, letting him in. "All right, then. If you're offering, I won't stop you. I was just about to fix the old fence in the backyard." Ethan grinned. "Perfect. I'm good with tools." They spent the next hour working side by side. The weather was warm but breezy, and the air smelled like cut grass and paint. Margaret hadn't realized how long it had been since she'd had company for such simple things: conversation, laughter, silence. That wasn't heavy. Ethan worked steadily, occasionally glancing her way, smiling when she teased him about his crooked hammering dot at one point. While they both stood back to look at the fixed fence, Ethan said quietly, "You know, this feels nice. Doing something that makes sense." Margaret looked at him curiously. "What do you mean?" He shrugged. "Lately, life hasn't made much sense, but helping out here, it feels right. It reminds me that not everything has to be complicated." She smiled softly. "Sometimes the simplest things are what keep us going." Ethan nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "You're right. I think I've been trying too hard to control everything: my future, my feelings, my loss. But here, I just feel calm." Margaret said nothing, but she felt it too. That unspoken calm that comes when two lonely souls understand each other without trying to fix anything. They moved to the porch when the work was done, sharing iced tea under the wide shade of the maple tree. The silence between them was gentle. The late afternoon light bathed everything in gold. Then Ethan spoke again, his voice lower. "Mrs. Green, can I tell you something personal?" "Of course," she said. He hesitated. "I don't know what's happening between Emily and me anymore. She's changed so much. I love her, but I think she's slipping away." Margaret looked at him, choosing her words carefully. "People change, Ethan. Sometimes love changes with them. That doesn't mean it disappears." He nodded, then looked up at her. "You know what she told me last week? She said she doesn't believe in love lasting forever. She said people just grow apart, and that's life." Margaret's heart sank. That doesn't sound like her. "I didn't think so either." But then she said something that really hurt. She said I was too serious, too old-fashioned for her. He gave a small, sad laugh. "Maybe she's right. Maybe I just love too deeply." Margaret's gaze softened. There's no such thing as loving too deeply. The world just doesn't know how to handle it anymore. Ethan looked at her then, not with confusion, but understanding. "That's exactly what my mom used to say," he whispered. "She always said love wasn't about being perfect. It was about staying even when it's hard." The moment hung between them like a fragile thread. a connection neither of them had planned but both felt deeply. Margaret could see the sincerity in his eyes, the kind that came from heartbreak and truth, not youthful infatuation. "I think your mom was a very wise woman," she said. "She was," Ethan replied. "You remind me of her more every time I come here." Margaret smiled softly. "You've said that before." "Psh, I know," he said, "but I mean it more now." They sat quietly after that. The light faded slowly, and a chill crept into the air. Margaret wrapped her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. Ethan noticed and reached for the blanket on the chair beside him, handing it to her. "Here," he said simply. She took it, their fingers brushing briefly. Neither spoke. It was just a small human gesture, nothing more. But something in it carried warmth. A few minutes later, she broke the silence. "You know, Ethan, maybe what Emily needs isn't space from you. Maybe she just needs to find herself a bit. You have to let her do that, even if it hurts." He nodded slowly. "I've been trying, but it's hard when you care so much." "I know," she said quietly. "Believe me, I know." He looked at her, his voice almost a whisper. "You must have loved your husband a lot." Margaret's eyes softened with memory. "I did. We were married 32 years. He was my best friend, my anchor. Losing him, it changed everything. But it also taught me something. Love doesn't really end. It just changes form. Sometimes it becomes silence. Sometimes it becomes strength." Ethan stared at her, clearly moved. "You talk about him like he's still here." "In a way, he is," she said with a small smile. "Every time I fix something he built or say something he used to say, I feel him near." Ethan nodded, emotion flickering in his eyes. "That's beautiful." The porch light flickered on as twilight deepened. For a long moment, they just sat there, two people from different worlds, bound by shared grief and quiet understanding. Finally, Ethan stood up, brushing his hands on his jeans. "I should go. Thank you for everything, Mrs. Green. I didn't realize how much I needed this talk." Margaret smiled gently. "Any time, Ethan. And next time, you don't have to fix a fence to visit." He chuckled softly. "I'll keep that in mind." As he walked toward the gate, he stopped and turned. His face was thoughtful, his voice steady but sincere. "Mrs. Green," he said, "I don't know how to explain this, but talking to you feels different. It's like you see the world the way I wish I could." Margaret felt her throat tighten. "That's kind of you to say." He gave a small, hesitant smile. "It's not kindness. It's truth." Then he paused. His next words quiet but deliberate. "You make me believe that peace still exists somewhere." Margaret didn't know what to say. The honesty in his tone caught her completely off guard. For a moment, she just looked at him, trying to find the right words. "I think peace exists wherever people care enough to listen." She said finally. Ethan nodded, his eyes warm. "Then I'm glad I found it here." He left after that, the gate closing softly behind him. Margaret stood on the porch for a long time, the evening breeze lifting her hair. The street was empty again, the silence returning, but it didn't feel lonely this time. It felt full, alive, like the world had shifted just slightly towards something new. Later that night, Margaret sat on her bed, reading a book she wasn't really seeing. Ethan's words echoed in her mind. "You make me believe that peace still exists somewhere." It had been years since anyone had said something that honest to her. Not romantic, not forced, just true. And in that truth, she felt something awaken inside her. Something gentle and long buried. It wasn't attraction, not the way stories often tell it. It was something deeper, a recognition between two people who had both lost pieces of themselves but still dared to reach out for understanding. She turned off the lamp and lay in the quiet. The sound of crickets outside her window. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel the weight of the empty house pressing down. Instead, she felt a warmth, not from memory, but from something new, something she didn't yet have a name for. And though she didn't know it yet, that warmth, that small, unspoken connection, would soon change everything she thought she knew about love, about forgiveness, and about finding peace where she least expected it. 2 days later, the autumn air carried a crisp chill that hinted winter wasn't far. Margaret stood in her kitchen making a pie for Emily's arrival. The house felt alive again. The scent of cinnamon and apples filled every corner. She had told herself this weekend would be good for everyone. Emily and Ethan clearly needed to talk, and maybe, just maybe, things would start to heal. By afternoon, Emily's car pulled into the driveway. Margaret wiped her hands and stepped out onto the porch. Emily rushed up the steps, smiling brightly. "Mom," she said, hugging her tightly. Margaret hugged her back, but something about Emily's energy felt distracted. Her daughter looked beautiful, as always, confident, fashionable, full of city life spark. But behind her cheerful smile, Margaret sensed a restlessness. "Long drive?" she asked. "Not too bad," Emily said, glancing at her phone. "Is Ethan around?" Margaret blinked. "No, not yet." "Why?" Emily hesitated, then said, "We're going to have a talk. It's about our relationship." There it was, the need to talk that had been hanging over Margaret's thoughts all week. She nodded slowly. "I see. Should I ask him to come by later?" Emily shook her head. "He said he might stop after work. I just hope it goes smoothly." Margaret wanted to comfort her, but something told her to stay quiet. Some lessons she knew people had to face on their own as the evening came. Ethan's familiar truck pulled into the driveway. Margaret watched from the porch as he stepped out, calm, polite, but a bit guarded. He greeted her with a warm smile. "Evening, Mrs. Green." "Hi, Ethan," she said softly. "Emily's waiting inside." He nodded and went in. Margaret stayed outside for a while, the fading sunlight washing over her as she listened faintly through the open window. At first, the voices inside were calm. Then they grew sharper. Emily's tone was defensive, Ethan's patient but pained. "You've changed," she heard Ethan say. "It feels like you're not even here anymore." "I just want more out of life than this small-town routine." Emily shot back. "You don't get it, Ethan. You're kind, but you're safe." There was a pause. Then Ethan's voice, low but steady. "Safe isn't a bad thing, Emily. It's what people build lives on." "I don't want safe," Emily said, her voice breaking slightly. "I want something exciting, something real." Margaret closed her eyes, her heart aching for both of them. She wanted to step in, but she knew she couldn't. This wasn't her moment. A few minutes later, the front door opened and Ethan stepped out. His face was pale, his jaw tight. He looked up and saw Margaret still sitting there. For a moment, he hesitated, then walked over, hands shoved deep in his pockets. "It's over," he said quietly. "She's moving to Los Angeles next month. Said she needs to figure out who she is." Margaret stood up, her heart breaking for him. "I'm sorry, Ethan." He shook his head. "Don't be. I think I knew it was coming. I just didn't want to admit it." They stood there in silence for a while, the sound of crickets rising from the yard. The porch light flickered softly. Then, after a long moment, Ethan said, "Can I stay a while? I don't feel like driving home yet." Margaret nodded. "Of course." They sat together on the porch steps, the same place where they had talked before. The air felt heavy but calm. It's the way it does after a storm has passed. "She's chasing something she doesn't even understand," Ethan said finally. "But I can't blame her. Maybe I was too still for her." Margaret looked at him with quiet empathy. Stillness isn't a weakness. It's strength. Not everyone is ready for that. He gave her a small, sad smile. "You always say the right thing." "I just say what I've learned," she replied. "Time has a way of teaching us more than we want to know." He looked at her, really looked, his gaze soft but intense. "You've been through loss, haven't you?" She nodded. "Yes, but I survived it, and one day I learned how to live again." He was silent for a long time. Then he said something she didn't expect. "You make me want to live again, too." Margaret froze slightly, her breath catching. "Ethan," she began, but he cut her off gently. "I don't mean anything wrong by it," he said quickly. "I just mean Talking to you makes me feel seen, like I matter again." She relaxed a little but couldn't ignore the tremor in her chest. His words were innocent but carried a weight, the kind that could easily be misunderstood. She could feel the line between comfort and something deeper blurring, just slightly. She smiled softly, trying to steady the air. We all need someone to remind us who we are sometimes. That's all part of being human. He nodded slowly. Yeah, maybe that's it. The wind picked up, rustling the trees. The world around them felt wrapped in quiet understanding. After a while, Margaret stood. "You should get some rest. Tomorrow's a new day." Ethan hesitated, then rose too. "Thank you for being here. I don't think I could have handled that conversation alone." She reached out and gently touched his arm, a small gesture full of kindness. "You're stronger than you think." Their eyes met for just a moment, and in that moment, neither spoke. It wasn't romantic, not in the usual sense, but it was powerful to souls, recognizing something unspoken, something that didn't need to be defined. Ethan finally nodded and walked toward his truck. Halfway there, he stopped and turned. "Mrs. Green, yes?" He looked at her, his voice quiet but sure. "I've meant what I said the other night about peace. You make me believe in it again. I hope you know that." She smiled faintly, her eyes warm. "Then hold on to that, Ethan. That's how you start healing." Smiled back, then left. The sound of his truck faded down the street. Leaving the night still once again, Margaret stood there for a long time, looking at the stars. She felt both proud and heartbroken, proud of how he handled himself, heartbroken for what had been lost. But beneath it all was something else. Peace. Maybe the same peace Ethan had spoken of. The next morning, Emily came down to the kitchen looking tired. "Mom," she said softly, "I ended things with Ethan. I hope you're not upset." Margaret shook her head. "No, sweetheart. Sometimes love doesn't work out the way we imagine. That's life." Emily hesitated. "He's a good man. I just didn't feel ready." "I know," Margaret said, "and that's all right. You'll both find your way." Emily smiled faintly. "You always make things sound so calm." Margaret smiled back. "That's because I've learned even endings can be gentle if you handle them with care." Later that afternoon, after Emily left to meet friends, Margaret went out to the yard. The fence Ethan had fixed stood firm under the autumn light. She ran her hand along the wood, feeling the smoothness where they'd worked side by side. A small note was wedged under one of the boards. She unfolded it slowly. "Mrs. Green, thank you for reminding me that kindness still matters. You probably don't realize it, but you helped me find my strength again. I'll be leaving town for a while to visit my father and think about things. But I'll never forget what you said. That peace comes from people who care enough to listen." You listened. That meant more than you'll ever know. Margaret's eyes welled with tears. She pressed the note to her chest, smiling through the ache. He was gone, but he was healing. And somehow she felt like she was too. As the sun began to set. She sat on the porch once more, watching the golden sky fade into soft pink. She thought about Tom, about Emily, about Ethan, about how life kept changing. It's taking things away, but always giving something new in return. Maybe love wasn't about forever. Maybe it was about the moments when two souls met and left each other better than before. That night, when she turned off the lamp and lay down, she didn't feel lonely. She felt thankful for the quiet lessons, for the unexpected friendships, and for the small miracles that came disguised as heartbreak. And though she didn't know it, somewhere on a distant road, Ethan drove beneath the same stars, carrying her words with him, a reminder that peace wasn't found in places or people, but in the moments when someone truly listens,